Welcome to The Cold War Turns Hot, Remembering the Korean War,
an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you.
Let's begin by reviewing the time period of the Korean War, which took place during the Cold War era. After the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were the two most powerful nations left standing, but the former allies now became enemies. America and the Soviet Union differed on issues of human rights, individual liberties, economic philosophies, and religious freedom. The U.S. was a capitalist democracy, a nation of free ideas and free trade. But the Soviet Union was a communist nation. Communism is an economic idea that all people should be equal and have the same, by any means necessary. In reality, communist nations like the Soviet Union took the form of dictatorships. Citizens were poor, were the victims of government propaganda, lacked basic rights like freedom of speech, and could not freely elect their leaders. The Soviet Union wanted to spread a communist revolution across the entire world. The U.S. was determined to oppose this. For almost 50 years, a Cold War existed between the United States and other democracies and the Soviet Union and other communist nations, which soon included China, the most populous nation on Earth. Both sides possessed nuclear weapons and were prepared to use them, so an actual war between them wasn't an option. It might have resulted in the end of human civilization. So the U.S. and the Soviet Union never actually went to war, directly at least. What they did do was square off in a series of smaller proxy wars involving other nations. A proxy is someone else who acts on your behalf. These conflicts allowed the two enemies to oppose each other while never using nuclear weapons. The Korean War is considered the first Cold War-era proxy war, and because of this, it is often called the first hot war of the Cold War. Let's take a look at some of the events leading up to the Korean War. Korea was ruled by Japan from 1910 until the closing days of World War II. In August 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Soviet troops advanced into northern Korea and accepted the surrender of the Japanese forces above the 38th parallel, while U.S. forces did the same south of the 38th parallel. When Japan surrendered and World War II came to an end in September 1945, Korean delegates were excluded from all talks between the Allied nations and had no say in the fate of their country. Both Koreas dreamed of unifying the country. However, with the onset of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States could not agree on a strategy that would produce a unified Korea. Rival Korean governments were formed when the Soviets helped install a communist government in the north, and the Americans helped set up a non-communist government in the south. In 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman convinced the United Nations to assume responsibility for the Koreas. The United Nations was a new international organization formed to maintain world peace and security. After a series of talks, the Soviet Union began withdrawing its forces from the north in 1948, and by mid-1949 only a small contingent of U.S. forces remained in the south. Other events during this time also increased international tension and insecurity. In 1949, Chinese communists assumed control of China, forming the People's Republic of China. Also in 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. In response, President Truman called for the construction of a hydrogen bomb, a bomb even more powerful than the atomic bomb. The nuclear arms race had begun, and over the next 40 years the two Cold War adversaries would make over 100,000 nuclear weapons, ready to be launched on land, sea, and in the air. As a new decade dawned, Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, and Mao Zedong, leader of the People's Republic of China, were convinced that America's withdrawal from South Korea made it vulnerable to a communist assault. Stalin and Mao encouraged the North Koreans to plan an attack on the South and unify the country under one communist government. The Korean War began when North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950. The fighting ended on July 27, 1953, when an armistice was signed. An armistice is not a peace treaty. It's an agreement to stop fighting, and technically these two countries are still at war even to this day. The Korean War began just 5 years after the end of World War II and was followed by the Vietnam War, a war America became heavily involved in throughout the 1960s and early 70s. As we discussed earlier, the Korean War is a Cold War conflict, a proxy war. It was the first hot war of the Cold War. The Korean War took place throughout the Korean peninsula, which extends south of China. The conflict brought in other participants. The Soviet Union and China aided North Korea because they wanted to see Korea united under communism. The U.S. was determined to not let that happen. American forces helped defend South Korea with soldiers from 16 other countries represented by the United Nations. Let's take a moment to look at a graphic you might find helpful as we move forward. The Korean War was a war in which the same ground was sometimes gained and lost by opposing sides multiple times throughout the war. As one example, Seoul, South Korea's capital, changed hands 4 times during the war. In this collection of 4 maps, you can see North Korean forces shaded in red and South Korean forces shaded in blue. At the start of the war, the 2 Koreas were divided at the 38th parallel. After the North invaded the South, in a few short months, Northern forces had conquered almost the entire southern half. Only a small area, what came to be called the Pusan perimeter, remained in the hands of the South. Then, in a few short months, Northern forces were repelled from the South, and Southern forces gained much territory in the North. By the time the armistice was signed, over 2.5 years later, the South lost the ground it had gained in the North, and the 2 Koreas held largely the same ground as when the war began. Let's examine in a little more detail why the United States got involved in the Korean War. First, let's back up a few years. In 1946, George Kennan, a diplomat stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, sent to the Truman administration what came to be known as the Long Telegram. It outlined his belief that the best way to deal with the Soviet Union was to adopt policies to keep the Soviets contained, or in other words, to keep the Soviet Union from expanding and spreading communism across the globe. However, Kennan believed that American power was limited, that not all crises were equally significant, and America had to decide selectively where and when it would get involved in conflicts. President Truman saw things a little differently. In 1947, he established what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. He declared it must be U.S. policy to provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under threat from internal or external authoritarian forces. In other words, if other countries were threatened by communism, from within or without, the U.S. would intervene and rescue them as a matter of America's national security. Kennan cringed at Truman's open-ended commitment to contain communism everywhere, but the Truman administration viewed the world in a state of permanent crisis because of communism. The administration believed in the domino theory, and this meant that if nations were like dominoes and one country fell to communist rule, then neighboring nations would also fall to communism. The U.S. wanted to prevent this from happening and viewed communism as if it were a disease that must be stopped from contaminating any more nations than were already infected. When North Korean forces invaded the South on June 25, 1950, members of the United Nations, which included the United States, declared the invasion illegal. The UN called for an immediate ceasefire, demanded the North Koreans pull their forces from the South, and return behind the 38th parallel. When the North refused to comply, Truman urged the members of the UN to use force to remove the North Koreans from the South. Truman also ordered American air, naval, and ground forces to defend the South from the communist invasion. Eventually, 16 countries from the United Nations would send soldiers to help defend South Korea, but the U.S. provided 88% of the troops. Truman appointed General Douglas MacArthur to lead the United Nations forces. MacArthur was a popular general well known for his military campaigns against the Japanese during World War II. Truman did not seek a declaration of war from the U.S. Congress, and instead initiated military action on his own. Because of this decision, the Korean War is considered an undeclared war, a conflict known as a police action. In the years immediately following the end of World War II, America's armed forces shrunk from 12 million to 1.5 million. When the Korean War began, manpower shortages for the U.S. forces in Korea were high. The American military had to be built up again. Through enlistments, reserve recalls, National Guard call-ups, and the draft, over 6 million men and women enlisted in the armed forces during the Korean War. About 38% of those entering the military were drafted. Those entering the military during the Korean War often grew up in the shadow of family members, friends, and neighbors who had served in World War II. Many had a generally positive view of military service and expected civilians on the home front to support them and the war effort, as they did in World War II. As we looked at earlier, the war unfolded in different and distinct phases, and each soldier's wartime experience differed depending on where and when a person served in the war zone. At the beginning of the war, when manpower was low, men were often shipped to the war zone soon after activation, receiving little training, often spending only days or weeks training before going overseas. Those who left together didn't always remain together, as many units were broken up or restructured before ever reaching battle. Often, individual replacements were plucked from the ranks and sent overseas separately. When the war began, North Korea sent 80,000 troops across the border into the south. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, was captured in just 3 days. President Truman, believing the Soviets were behind North Korea's attack, declared, "The attack upon Korea makes it plain beyond all doubt that communism has passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations and will now use armed invasion and war." The first phase of the Korean War was marked mostly by misery and retreat for UN forces. The Battle of Osan took place on July 5, 1950, and was the first significant American combat engagement of the war. This photograph was taken on July 5th, and it shows members of the 24th Infantry Division, the first U.S. ground units to reach the front, fighting against North Korean forces in a village near Osan. At right is Private First Class Kenneth Shadrick, who was killed by enemy fire a few moments after this photo was made, thus becoming the first United States soldier to die in the Korean War. UN forces were unable to hold back the enemy at Osan, and the North Korean army continued to push further south. Throughout the first 2 months of the war, North Korean troops steadily advanced southward down the peninsula, beating UN troops in a series of engagements, forcing them to retreat further and further southward until only a small area around the port city of Pusan was held by Southern forces. At this point, North Korea had taken control of 90% of the Korean peninsula. From early August through mid-September, UN forces fought the Battle of Pusan perimeter. It was one of the first major engagements of the Korean War. During this time, American forces nearly doubled their strength in Korea. Reinforcements and supplies streamed through the port city of Pusan. 140,000 UN troops, including 84,000 American soldiers, fought to defend the Pusan perimeter from the North Korean army. The North Korean army at Pusan was over 98,000 strong, but it lacked naval and air support. American tank battalions deployed to Korea from California directly to the port of Pusan. By late August, some 500 tanks were battle-ready at the Pusan perimeter. UN Navy and Air Forces also aided the fight. Daily bombing by the U.S. Air Force planes destroyed 32 bridges, halting most daytime road and rail traffic, forcing the enemy to move largely at night. After 6 weeks, North Korean forces collapsed and retreated from the Pusan perimeter in defeat. In a series of nationwide polls conducted in July and August 1950, 66% of Americans polled believed the U.S. made the right decision in entering the war, and 68% favored stopping Soviet and therefore communist expansion, but only 14% expected the war to last more than a year. On August 17th, the U.S., through the United Nations, announced its goal of a unified anti-communist Korea. As North Korean forces were engaged in the Battle of the Pusan perimeter, General MacArthur, head of UN forces, was planning a surprise amphibious landing 100 miles behind the North Korean lines at Incheon, the port city for Seoul. MacArthur's selection of Incheon was a daring and, some said, risky choice. The beach line had numerous disadvantages, including a tidal variation that only allowed use of the beach for 6 hours a day. Also, The only approach to the port was through a narrow, tortuous channel that was defended from the harbor by an island called Walmido. However, MacArthur believed the area was weakly defended by North Korean forces, most of which were engaged in the Battle of Pusan Perimeter. He hoped an attack on Incheon would enable UN forces to cut off communications and supply lines to North Korean troops. Incheon's close vicinity to Seoul, South Korea's capital, also made it an ideal choice. If UN forces could retake Seoul from the enemy, it would provide a huge morale boost for Southern forces and could even turn the tide of the war. The 5-day Battle of Incheon would consist of more than 40,000 UN infantry forces against an estimated enemy force of less than 7,000. On September 10, 1950, MacArthur instituted naval gun and aerial bombardments of Incheon and Walmido Island. During the bombardments, much of the city of Incheon was destroyed. On September 15th, U.S. Marines assaulted Walmido Island and landed along Incheon's waterfront. Fighting in Incheon continued in the days that followed, but the small contingent of North Korean forces could not hold back UN forces as they advanced towards Seoul. After several days of fighting, on September 25th, exactly 3 months after the war began, Seoul was recaptured by UN forces. Once word got out of the surprise landing at Incheon, North Korean forces in the south made a hasty retreat from the Pusan perimeter up the Korean peninsula, and UN forces began advancing northward. As MacArthur predicted, the successful surprise landing on Incheon did transform the course of the war, at least temporarily, as it allowed UN forces to switch from defensive mode to offensive mode. American newspapers hailed MacArthur's success, filling articles with descriptions of Marines pouring ashore, troops conducting blazing attacks while crushing the North Korean army in a giant nutcracker, as thundering American air power left Walmido Island smoking like a volcano. The landing at Incheon is still considered to be one of the greatest operations in military history. After the victories of Incheon, Pusan, and the recapture of Seoul, a mounting sense that the war would soon be won emerged. Just days after Seoul was recaptured by UN forces, MacArthur was authorized to conduct military operations north of the 38th parallel, but he was cautioned to limit operations if the Soviets or Chinese threatened to intervene. By October 1st, UN forces had crossed the 38th parallel and headed northward towards Korea's border with Communist China. The mission now was to occupy all of North Korea and eliminate the North Korean army. The political objective of the war had changed from containment to liberation. By October 20th, UN forces had entered Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. 6 days later, advanced units reached Chosan on the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. MacArthur continued to reassure Truman of his belief that the Chinese would not enter the war, and he predicted total victory by Christmas. However, the direction and length of the war was about to change. Troops from Communist China soon began to cross the border from China into Korea to help its North Korean ally, and the Soviet Union increased its material aid to assist China's efforts. Some criticized MacArthur for ignoring intelligence that showed 260,000 Chinese troops massed across the border, and others criticized him for failing to heed warnings from China that said if UN forces crossed the 38th parallel, its troops would be sent to aid the North Koreans. The Chinese warned that any foreign forces north of the 38th parallel posed a threat to China's national security. When reflecting back on this phase of the Korean War, some historians say the war could have ended in October when UN forces had restored the pre-invasion boundaries of North and South Korea along the 38th parallel. However, it is important to remember that just a few months prior, the U.S., through the UN, had announced its goal of a unified anti-communist Korea. Nationwide polls conducted in October showed over 60% of Americans supported continuing the fight into North Korea until its army surrendered. Many American newspapers openly supported the reunification of Korea, and editorials frequently reiterated that the American public would never stand for a war that ended where it began, calling for the 38th parallel to be crossed, the North taken over, and a self-sustaining state established with communism driven from its borders. Phase 3 of the Korean War began when troops from Communist China entered the war. Looking back at this phase, MacArthur remarked, it had become an entirely different war. This phase consisted of North Korean and Chinese forces supported by military aid from the Soviet Union in the form of guns, tanks, and planes, steadily pushing UN forces out of North Korea. Chinese forces began with a series of combat engagements now called the Battle of Unsan that took place from October 25th to November 4th, 1950. On November 1st, U.S. infantrymen experienced their first direct fighting with Chinese Communist forces, fighting that resulted in large U.S. losses. On November 25th, nearly 200,000 Chinese soldiers poured across the Yalu River, forcing UN troops into a retreat. In November, MacArthur demanded authority to bomb Chinese forces north of the Yalu River in China. Truman, averse to widening the war and fearing the action may cause the Soviet Union to enter troops into the war, said no. Although in a press conference that month, Truman admitted the U.S. was considering use of atomic bombs in the war. At the end of November, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir began. Chosin Reservoir is a man-made lake located high in the mountains of the northeast corner of the Korean peninsula that supplied hydroelectric power to industrial cities below. The battle lasted 17 days and was fought during some of the harshest winter weather conditions of the war. The temperature plunged to as low as 35 degrees below zero, contributing to frostbite, icy roads, frozen medical supplies, and malfunctioning weapons and equipment. Remembers one soldier, the toughest part about the battle and what was going on around you was trying to keep from freezing to death. During the 17-day battle, the 30,000-strong UN force, which included 15,000 U.S. troops, found itself surrounded by an estimated Chinese force of 80,000 men. The weather made it almost impossible to resupply UN troops, and men quickly began running out of food, medical supplies, and ammunition. A break in the weather finally allowed planes to drop rations and ammunition, but UN forces still had to work their way through the Chinese divisions in a fighting withdrawal. Remembers one soldier, it's amazing that anybody walked out of there at all without being wounded or killed. Of the 15,000 U.S. troops involved in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, 3,000 were killed and 6,000 were wounded. Those who survived are often called the Chosin Few, as in the chosen few who lived through the brutal campaign. But Chinese forces paid an even greater price with an estimated 60,000 men lost to combat and the cold weather. At the end of December, Truman told MacArthur that the U.S. had abandoned its goal of reunifying Korea and wanted to seek a settlement to end the war. MacArthur was furious. To him, simply containing the enemy meant little more than accepting defeat. MacArthur proposed his own plan for victory, which included a blockade of Communist China's coastline and permission to bomb industrial sites and other strategic targets in China. Fearing these actions would launch World War III, Truman said no. By early January 1951, the Chinese and North Korean forces had pushed UN troops back past the 38th parallel into South Korea and retaken Seoul. By the middle of January, UN forces began another slow advance northward toward the 38th parallel, an advance many troops called the Meat Grinder. Also in January, Time magazine named the GI in Korea Man of the Year. And in striking contrast to nationwide polls conducted in the early months of the war, in January 1951, 66% of Americans polled wanted to pull U.S. forces out of Korea. Infantrymen serving in the Korean War fought the enemy in challenging, brutal terrain and often in extreme weather. As one historian has stated, the Korean peninsula itself killed soldiers as handily as the North Koreans or Chinese. Winters were harsh, and temperatures could dip 30 or 40 degrees below zero. In the early phase of the war, the freezing temperatures were made much worse because the men were often not supplied adequate cold weather gear. Soldiers and Marines became victims of frostbite, losing fingers and toes. Weapons malfunctioned due to the extreme cold, and socks and equipment froze to unprotected skin. Digging holes in the ground for protection from the enemy was a misery if the frozen ground could be shoveled at all. On the other hand, summertime in Korea brought its own challenges. Monsoons brought a long rainy season that left soldiers slogging through mud, and temperatures regularly rose past 100 degrees with 90% humidity. Infantrymen traveled up and down Korea's steep, craggy hills, carrying weapons, ammunition, and packs that could weigh more than 80 pounds. Soldiers were often forced to attack uphill with grenades and artillery raining down from the enemy entrenched above them. Said one soldier, "Braving enemy fire was one thing, but having to crawl up the steep slopes with bullets buzzing and striking all around us was just madness." The hilly terrain could also slow down tank travel. UN forces battled with North Koreans, who in the beginning of the war fought in huge human waves. The Chinese fought in large mobs with little technology, and they often fought at night, which UN soldiers hated. The Chinese rarely attacked quietly. The eerie wailings of bugles, sharp calls of whistles, and sounds of rattling cans unnerved soldiers and alerted them an attack was imminent. A rotation system for individual soldiers and Marines was used for American forces. Each person received points each month at varying levels based on whether they served on the front lines or in the rear. After a person accumulated 36 points, he could rotate out of the war zone. This could boost morale as each man knew when he was going home, but it was also very disruptive to those left behind. Losses of experienced soldiers could break down the effectiveness of those left in a unit. In the field and at the front lines, soldiers lived mostly in holes in the ground, called foxholes, and they had no access to showers or laundry facilities. Soldiers worked, dug holes, sweated, bled, fought, and slept in their same pair of combat fatigues until relieved by some other unit or sent away from the front into reserve. This could last for weeks at a time. Some soldiers suffered with dysentery, lice, and coughs that never went away. The living conditions behind the front lines weren't that much better. Soldiers often lived in tents without electricity and adequate cooling or heating, and showers and latrines were outside. These were miserable to use, especially in winter. While infantrymen fought along the ground, the skies high above them were active throughout the war. Flying from aircraft carriers off the coast or from bases in Japan or Korea, pilots supporting UN forces flew more than 1 million combat missions over the Korean peninsula, dropping bombs on enemy targets, providing air cover to troops below, and engaging in deadly duels with fighter jets called MiG-15s that the Soviets supplied to Chinese and North Korean forces. Some MiGs were even covertly flown by Soviet pilots. The Korean War was the first war to involve aerial combat between fighter jets. Men aboard ships also delivered infantrymen to the war zone, cleared coastal waters from mines, attacked enemy targets on land, and evacuated soldiers and civilians. Fighting conditions in the Korean War were also unique for reasons beyond the challenges of the terrain and the extremes in weather. In 1948, 3 years after World War II ended, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981. This order declared that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. The president was determined to end military segregation through this executive order. Despite Truman's executive order, when the Korean War began, there was resistance to ending segregation within the military. Segregation remained rampant, especially in the Marine Corps and Army, where all black units and in some instances all Puerto Rican units remained the status quo. At the outset of the war, whether or not black troops had trained in mixed-race groups stateside, many black GIs were assigned to segregated units overseas. Additionally, black service members found it difficult to advance in rank, were often forced to do menial jobs, and were frequently stereotyped as cowardly and ineffective. As the war progressed and American casualties began to mount, segregated units were sometimes disbanded and merged with other non-segregated units to increase the size of the fighting force. With integrated units fighting on the front lines, men had to rely and depend upon one another for survival, regardless of race. Remembers Ben Nighthorse Campbell, a Native American Korean War veteran who went on to serve as a senator in Colorado. Men learned to understand people who are different from you. By working and fighting alongside the peoples of different colors, creeds, and backgrounds, we are, at the same time, I hope, beginning to learn how we may better live with them. Remembers another Korean War veteran about the men in his integrated unit. We were like real brothers. The Korean War proved a testing ground for integration, bringing thousands of Americans of different colors and ethnicities into close contact with one another for the first time. As the number of integrated units grew, desegregation proved a great success on the battlefield. By late spring of 1951, it became policy to assign men individually to understrength units based on nothing more than their job specialty. Officials in the U.S. Armed Forces began to work toward full integration worldwide. By October 30th, 1954, a little over a year after the fighting had ended in the Korean War, the Secretary of Defense announced its last segregated unit of the armed forces had been abolished. The fourth and final phase of the Korean War began in February 1951 and lasted until July 1953. After UN forces began a slow advance north towards the 38th parallel in mid-January 1951, UN forces were able to retake Seoul from the enemy in March. This was the fourth and final time Seoul changed hands during the war. By the end of March, UN forces had again reached the 38th parallel. President Truman began work on a peace proposal that would restore the pre-war boundary and remove all foreign troops from the Koreas. After MacArthur received notice of Truman's proposal, he undermined Truman by issuing his own terms for ending the war. He made a public statement, an ultimatum, threatening to attack China unless the Chinese gave up the fight. He even said he would meet with the Chinese to arrange how to end the war. MacArthur's statement ruined Truman's efforts at negotiating a ceasefire and made many question who exactly was in charge of U.S. foreign policy, the President of the United States or General MacArthur. This was just one instance in a series of public statements that a frustrated MacArthur had been making for months, public statements that continued to advocate for his plan to achieve victory, that criticized leaders in Washington for refusing to allow him to bomb Chinese bases north of the Yalu River, and that challenged the Truman administration's entire approach towards the war. Said MacArthur, "Never before has this nation been engaged in martial combat with a hostile power without military objective, without policy other than restrictions governing operations, or indeed without even formally recognizing a state of war." On April 5th, on the floor of Congress, a letter was read in which MacArthur criticized the president and said in this war, a war against communism, there was no substitute for victory. This was the final straw, and on April 11th, Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination and removed him from command. He was replaced by General Matthew Ridgway. Truman's firing of MacArthur ignited an uproar across America, as many disagreed with Truman's decision, and many more questioned what was happening in Korea. For MacArthur's lifetime of military service, he received a hero's welcome home, and even gave a departing speech to a joint session of Congress where he remarked, "I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty." During the final phase of the Korean War, UN and communist forces spent much of the spring and summer of 1951 jockeying for position, with battles that continually moved the front lines above and below the 38th parallel. One soldier lamented, "We're doing nothing but holding on to what we already have and fighting to get back what we lose. Then, after getting it back, we sit down and wait for them to try to take it away again. We should be pushing on and getting this war over and done with." In June 1951, the Soviet Union called for ceasefire negotiations, and 1 month later the first round of peace talks began. By this time, the war had largely fallen into a stalemate with troops dug in on both sides of the 38th parallel. Soldiers dug trenches, some 5 to 7 feet deep, living for weeks or months on the front line before being replaced by other units. Unfortunately, the peace talks would drag on for the next 2 years, continually being stopped and restarted as the opposing sides attempted to work out their differences. Two of the chief snags that held up negotiations were coming to terms with the exchange of military prisoners and South Korea's insistence on unification. Fighting didn't completely stop during these years, and GIs still fought battles like the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, Battle of the Punch Bowl, and the Battle of Pork Chop Hill. In January 1953, America saw a new president take the helm. Dwight D. Eisenhower, a World War II veteran and former 5-star general in the United States Army, best remembered for leading the Allied invasion of Europe on D-Day, became the 34th President of the United States. The fighting finally ended on July 27, 1953, when an armistice was signed. As we said earlier in this tutorial, an armistice is not a peace treaty. It is an agreement to stop fighting. and technically North and South Korea are still at war even to this day. After signing the armistice agreement, U.S. General Mark W. Clark stated that he had the inevitable distinction of being the first U.S. Army commander to sign an armistice without victory. Signing of the armistice allowed the return of prisoners of war and also created the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, that would now separate the two Koreas. The Korean DMZ serves as a buffer zone between the Koreas, a 2.5-mile-wide, 160-mile-long tract of land that runs mostly a little north of the 38th parallel. Even today, it is the most heavily militarized border in the world, with soldiers patrolling the border 24 hours a day. Due to ongoing hostilities between the Koreas, almost 25,000 U.S. troops are still currently stationed in South Korea. Over 7,000 Americans were captured by North Korea or Chinese forces during the Korean War. North Korean soldiers routinely mistreated or even killed American GIs at the time of capture. For those who survived the initial capture, they underwent brutal long-distance marches to temporary POW camps and later to permanent camps along the Yalu River or to holding facilities far from potential rescue by UN forces. Prisoners experienced torture, exposure to the elements, isolation, lack of medical care, and starvation diets that caused many prisoners to lose as much as half their body weight. Some estimates show that as many as 30 to 40% of POWs, or nearly 3,000 Americans, died in captivity. The Chinese did not routinely mistreat American GIs at the time of capture, but once under control of the Chinese, American servicemen suffered nearly as much as under the North Koreans. In addition, the Chinese used psychological warfare and brainwashing techniques, where soldiers were forced to listen to anti-American lectures and read and memorize communist doctrine and propaganda. Remembers one POW, the Chinese captors relentlessly pounded this communist theory down, around, and through our skulls. Repetition, 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 until whether we wanted it to or not, unconsciously, a little of the poison began to seep into our brain cells, although in our hearts we know it wasn't true. After October 1951, due to resumed peace talks, POWs in permanent Chinese camps began to receive improved treatment that included blankets, uniforms, new shoes, more food, and some medical care. Oddly, in November 1952, eager to show the world how well they treated POWs, the North Koreans and Chinese held a POW Olympics, where more than 500 prisoners from various countries competed in events like baseball, football, track and field, soccer, gymnastics, and boxing. No prisoner exchanges took place until April 1953, when UN and communist forces traded sick and wounded prisoners in Operation Little Switch. Through this operation, 149 Americans made their way home. A few months after signing the armistice, Operation Big Switch returned over 4,300 American servicemen. 21 released American POWs refused to return home and chose instead to live in China. Rumors began to spread that the Chinese had used brainwashing techniques to successfully turn some American POWs to communism. Films in the 1950s and 60s fed off these fears. Korean War veterans returned home saddened to discover that many Americans were apathetic about the conflict and that too many civilians were unaware the war had even been happening or even knew where Korea was at. The war has often been called the Forgotten War, largely because of the lack of public attention it received both during and after the war. Said one historian, unlike their brothers and cousins who served in World War II and returned to ticker-tape parades and welcoming bands, Korean War veterans returned quietly to a country that, in their absence, scarcely missed them. Lack of public attention notwithstanding, the war had cost the U.S. more than 36,000 military deaths and over 103,000 wounded. Some estimates show that South Korea suffered over 200,000 military deaths, and that North Korea and Chinese military forces suffered over 1 million losses, and that 1.5 million Korean civilians on both sides had been killed. Returning U.S. veterans were divided over what the war had accomplished. Some celebrated that UN forces were able to drive the enemy back across the border and deny them the victory they sought in creating a unified communist Korea. They challenged Americans to imagine what a unified Korea today under a communist dictatorship would be like. Others wished they had been allowed to finish the job by taking over the North and unifying the Koreas under one non-communist government. Others focused on the fact that, despite considerations to do so, nuclear weapons were never used in the Korean War, and the onset of World War III had been avoided. In 1986, Congress authorized the construction of a Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. to honor veterans from the war, but it only allocated $1 million to the project. Veterans raised another $5 million on their own, and the memorial was completed in July 1995. In thinking about the legacy of the Korean War, it was a war of many firsts. It was America's first undeclared war, the Cold War's first hot war, the first involvement in a war for the newly formed United Nations, the first and only direct battlefield engagements between the U.S. and China, and largely the only time troops from the free world advanced into a communist state, in this case North Korea, in an attempt to defeat and roll back communism by force.